Parker Schnabel has been mining gold in front of millions. But what the cameras didn't capture would shock even his closest allies. Behind the muddy boots and heavy machinery lies a carefully constructed facade that's finally crumbling. The truth about Parker's double life is about to surface, and it changes everything you thought you knew about Gold Rush's golden boy. The hidden truth. Parker Schnabel became a household name as the youngest mining boss ever to strike it big on the Discovery Channel's Gold Rush. Millions watched him transform from a 16-year-old kid working his grandfather's claim into a multimillionaire before his 30th birthday. The narrative was straightforward, compelling, and incredibly marketable. A young man honoring his grandfather's legacy while conquering the brutal Yukon wilderness. But narratives, especially those crafted for television, rarely tell the complete story. What viewers didn't know was that Parker's life off-camera bore little resemblance to the character they'd come to admire. While the show portrayed him as a single-minded workaholic devoted entirely to mining, the reality was far more complex. Behind closed doors, Parker had been living an entirely separate existence, one filled with business ventures, relationships, and pursuits that would have fundamentally altered public perception of who he really was. The first cracks in the facade appeared not through investigative journalism or leaked documents, but through minor, almost imperceptible inconsistencies. Social media posts didn't align with filming schedules. Property records that revealed purchases far from the gold fields, business registrations under different names, flight manifests showing trips to locations unrelated to mining operations. Individually, these breadcrumbs meant nothing. Collectively, they painted a portrait of a man leading two distinctly different lives. Those closest to Parker knew fragments of the truth, but even they didn't grasp the full scope of his double life. His crew members saw one version, his family another, and the television audience yet another carefully curated iteration. He'd become a master compartmentalizer, keeping each sphere of his existence separate and distinct. The question that haunted those who eventually pieced it together was simple yet profound. Why would someone already famous and successful feel the need to hide entire portions of their life? The answer, as it turns out, involves millions of dollars, hidden business empires, secret relationships, and a calculated strategy to maintain an image that would continue generating the revenue streams he'd become dependent upon. Parker Schnabel wasn't just mining gold from the earth. He was mining something far more valuable from his audience. Their trust, their investment, and their unwavering belief in the authenticity of what they were watching. The revelation of his double life didn't emerge all at once. It came in waves, each one more startling than the last, building toward a crescendo that would force Parker to confront the complicated web he'd woven. And once you understand the whole picture, you'll never watch Gold Rush the same way again. The man behind the gold pan. To understand Parker Schnabel's double life, you first need to know where it all began. Born in Hannes, Alaska in 1994, Parker grew up in a mining family where gold wasn't just a commodity, it was a way of life. His grandfather, John Schnabel, had operated the Big Nugget mine for decades, and Parker spent his childhood learning the trade. By the time he was 5 years old, he could operate heavy machinery. By 10, he understood placer mining better than most adults. This wasn't a hobby or a summer job. This was his inheritance and his destiny. When Parker was just 16, his grandfather handed him control of the mining operation. It was an enormous responsibility, one that would have crushed most teenagers. He thrived under the pressure, making decisions that miners twice his age struggled with. Within his first season running the operation, he'd already demonstrated the business acumen and leadership skills that would eventually make him a star. The Discovery Channel noticed Gold Rush was looking for fresh blood, new characters to inject energy into a show that was already capturing America's fascination with the rough-and-tumble world of gold mining. Parker was perfect, young, photogenic, talented, and carrying forward a family legacy. The cameras started rolling, and almost overnight, Parker Schnabel became famous. But fame came with expectations. Television producers understood that audiences wanted authenticity, or at least the appearance of it. They wanted to see Parker as the hard-working, no-nonsense miner who lived and breathed gold. Any deviation from that image could threaten the show's success and by extension, Parker's newfound celebrity status. So, a version of Parker was crafted for television, one that emphasized certain traits while completely obscuring others. What the show didn't reveal was that Parker had been nurturing business instincts that extended far beyond mining. Even as a teenager, he'd begun making investments, purchasing properties, and exploring ventures that had nothing to do with gold extraction. His mind worked differently from the television character suggested. At the same time, the show portrayed him as singularly focused on mining. The honest Parker was constantly calculating, diversifying, and building an empire that existed entirely outside the camera's frame. His education also tells a story that the show largely ignored. While Parker forewent a traditional college education to focus on mining, he didn't abandon education altogether. He invested heavily in private tutors, business consultants, and mentors from entirely different industries. He studied real estate development, cryptocurrency before it was mainstream, and international trade. These weren't the pursuits of a simple gold miner. They were the strategic moves of someone building something much larger. Friends from his childhood remember a Parker that television audiences never saw, someone fascinated by technology, deeply interested in global economics, and constantly reading books on business strategy and investment. Parker would spend hours discussing market trends, analyzing risk management strategies, and planning ventures that had nothing to do with moving dirt and washing gravel. But this Parker didn't fit the narrative Gold Rush was selling. The television Parker was charming in his simplicity. Wake up, mine gold, overcome obstacles, repeat. The honest Parker was infinitely more complex, more ambitious, and more calculated than anyone realized. He understood that the show was making him famous and he was willing to play the role. But he also understood that fame was a tool, not an end point. While millions watched him chase gold in the Yukon, he was simultaneously building a business empire that would eventually dwarf his mining profits. The duality was intentional, carefully constructed, and remarkably effective. For years, Parker successfully maintained these parallel existences. Neither world fully aware of the other. The mining world knew him as a reality television star. The business world knew him as a savvy investor operating under different company names and through various LLCs. And the television audience knew him as the character they'd been sold. But keeping two lives separate requires constant vigilance, perfect timing, and an enormous amount of energy. And even the most carefully maintained facades eventually develop cracks. The Secret Empire. While Parker Schnabel was pulling millions of dollars worth of gold from the ground on camera, he was simultaneously building a business empire that few people knew existed. The scope of his off-camera ventures is staggering, encompassing everything from real estate holdings across 3 countries to technology investments that would surprise even his most devoted fans. The real estate portfolio alone tells a remarkable story. Through a network of limited liability companies with names bearing no resemblance to his own, Parker had been acquiring properties since he was barely 18 years old. His first purchase was a modest apartment building in Anchorage, financed in part with early mining profits, but managed through a corporate structure that kept his name out of public records. This wasn't about hiding illegal activity. It was about maintaining the image of the simple miner while operating as a sophisticated businessman. By his mid-20s, Parker's real estate holdings had expanded dramatically. He owned commercial properties in Seattle, residential developments in Arizona, and vacation rentals in Hawaii. Each acquisition was strategic. Each was managed through different corporate entities, and each generated revenue streams that had nothing to do with gold mining. The total value of these holdings exceeded $20 million. Yet, the television show portrayed him as someone whose entire financial life revolved around seasonal mining operations. But real estate was just the beginning. Parker had also become an early investor in several technology startups, particularly those focused on mining technology and geological surveying equipment. This made strategic sense given his industry knowledge, but he'd also invested in companies entirely unrelated for mining, a meal delivery service, a fitness app, and even a cryptocurrency exchange. These weren't small investments either. In several cases, he'd put in six-figure sums, taking significant equity positions, and occasionally joining advisory boards under agreements that required confidentiality. The cryptocurrency investments deserve particular attention. Long before Bitcoin became a mainstream topic of conversation, Parker had begun accumulating digital assets. According to sources familiar with his portfolio, he'd invested heavily in Bitcoin when it was trading below $1,000 per coin and had diversified into Ethereum and several other cryptocurrencies. By 2024, these holdings had appreciated to values that some estimates put in excess of $50 million. Yet on television, Parker was portrayed as someone who barely understood modern technology, often fumbling with basic equipment and appearing technologically unsophisticated. The contradiction was deliberate. Parker understood that his value to Gold Rush lay in his relatability, down-to-earth nature, and focused solely on the traditional work of mining. Revealing his sophisticated investment portfolio and business acumen would complicate that narrative. It might make him seem less authentic, more calculating, and potentially less sympathetic to audiences who admired his supposed simple dedication to his grandfather's legacy. He'd also quietly become involved in several mining operations that never appeared on television. While the gold rush followed his primary claim in the Yukon, Parker had simultaneously been operating or investing in mining ventures in Nevada, Australia, and parts of South America. These operations were substantial, employing dozens of workers and extracting significant amounts of gold. Some were more profitable than his televised mining activities. Yet they remained completely unknown to the show's audience. The management structure Parker created for these various enterprises was sophisticated, bordering on Byzantine. He employed different accountants for different ventures, used separate legal teams, and maintained strict information silos to ensure that knowledge of one business didn't leak into others. Even his mining crew, the people he worked alongside daily on camera, had no idea about the full scope of his business activities. They knew Parker the miner, not Parker the real estate mogul or cryptocurrency investor. Perhaps most surprisingly, Parker had also become a significant investor in conservation efforts and environmental restoration projects. Through yet another set of corporate entities, he'd funded river restoration projects, wildlife habitat preservation, and even renewable energy initiatives. This philanthropy was genuine and substantial, involving millions of dollars in donations and investments. Yet, it remained almost entirely secret, known only to the organizations receiving the funding and a small circle of advisors. The question naturally arises, why keep all of this secret? The answer is both complex and straightforward. Simple, because maintaining his television image was financially lucrative, generating income through appearance fees, endorsements, and the overall success of Gold Rush. Complex because Parker had developed a deep ambivalence about his fame, simultaneously leveraging it for business opportunities while resenting the constraints it placed on his actual life and identity. This secret empire wasn't just about money or business success. It was about autonomy, about maintaining a version of himself that existed independent of television cameras and audience expectations. It was about proving perhaps only to himself that he was more than the character millions watched every week. But empires, even secret ones, are difficult to maintain indefinitely. And Parker's was about to face its greatest challenge yet, double lives and hidden ventures. The logistics of maintaining Parker's double life were extraordinarily complex. Filming for Gold Rush typically consumed 6 to 8 months each year, during which time Parker needed to be almost constantly on camera or at least accessible to producers. Yet during this same period, he was also managing business operations across multiple time zones, attending board meetings, reviewing investment opportunities, and overseeing property developments. The coordination required was exhausting and increasingly unsustainable. Parker developed elaborate systems to make it work. He employed personal assistants who operated under strict confidentiality agreements, managing his various business interests while he was in the Yukon. He scheduled phone conferences for odd hours, often calling into meetings at 3 o'clock or 4 in the morning before filming began or late at night after shooting wrapped. He became an expert at compartmentalizing, mentally shifting between Parker the miner and Parker the businessman with practiced ease. Technology became both an enabler and a liability. Encrypted communication apps allowed him to conduct sensitive business discussions without leaving evident traces. Virtual private networks masked his internet activity. Multiple email addresses and phone numbers kept different aspects of his life separate. But this same technology also created digital footprints that, if examined closely enough, revealed inconsistencies in a carefully constructed narrative. There were close calls. During one season of filming, Parker needed to attend an urgent meeting in San Francisco regarding a significant real estate transaction. He told producers he needed 2 days off for a family emergency, flew to California under an assumed name on a private charter, completed his meeting, and returned before anyone questioned his absence. Another time, a business associate nearly exposed Parker's investments during a public event, catching themselves just before mentioning his name in connection with a property development deal. The stress of maintaining these parallel lives took its toll. Those close to Parker noticed changes in his behavior, increased irritability, difficulty sleeping, and a tendency toward paranoia about information leaks. He became obsessive about controlling information, sometimes to the point of damaging relationships with people who were simply trying to help him manage his various interests. The weight of the double life was becoming unbearable. His mining crew occasionally noticed oddities that didn't quite add up. Phone calls that required Parker to step away from filming and speak privately. Meetings with people who were clearly business associates rather than anyone connected to mining operations. Financial decisions that seemed overly cautious or sophisticated for someone supposedly focused entirely on extracting gold from the ground. But Parker was skilled at deflecting questions, and his crew respected him enough not to push too hard for answers. The business world presented its own challenges. In boardrooms and investor meetings, Parker needed to project confidence and expertise to be taken seriously as a sophisticated businessman rather than a reality television personality. Some potential partners were skeptical, viewing his fame as a liability or questioning whether he could be a serious investor. Others tried to leverage his celebrity status in ways that made him uncomfortable, wanting to use his name and image in connection with ventures he wanted kept entirely separate from his public persona. Parker also began developing ventures that specifically exploited the gap between his two lives. He invested in companies that served the mining industry. Using his insider knowledge and television platform to identify opportunities while keeping his involvement hidden from the public, he purchased mineral rights and claims that he quietly explored. Separate from his televised operations, sometimes discovering deposits more valuable than what the cameras were following. The financial returns from this double life were substantial. While his gold rush income was significant, comprising appearance fees, percentages of the show's profits, and endorsement deals, his off-camera business ventures were generating even more substantial returns. By some estimates, Parker's total net worth had exceeded $100 million by his late 20s, a figure far beyond what mining alone could have generated and well beyond what television audiences would have imagined. But wealth wasn't the only motivation. Parker had developed a complex relationship with his fame, simultaneously appreciating the opportunities it created while resenting the constraints it imposed. He wanted to be recognized for his business acumen, not just his ability to extract gold. He wanted intellectual respect, not just celebrity admiration. The double life allowed him to pursue these goals while maintaining the public image that had made him successful in the first place. Romantic. The psychological toll, however, was mounting. Living authentically requires integrating all aspects of one's identity. But Parker had fragmented himself into incompatible pieces. He was playing different roles in different contexts, never quite able to be his complete self in any single situation. Friends from before his fame noticed that he'd become guarded, strategic in what he shared, always calculating what information was safe to reveal to whom. Romantic relationships suffered, particularly under the weight of this double life, creating complications that would eventually contribute to the unraveling of his carefully constructed facade. But those complications deserve their own examination, revealing yet another layer of the secret life Parker Schnabel had been living. The relationships no one saw coming. Parker Schnabel's romantic life has always been a topic of intense interest among Gold Rush fans. The show occasionally featured his relationships, most notably with Ashley Yulee, whose departure from both the show and Parker's life played out on camera. But what audiences didn't know was that Parker's romantic history was far more complex and in some cases completely hidden from public view. During the same period he was dating Ashley, Parker had maintained a separate relationship with a woman who worked in his real estate business, someone completely unconnected to mining or television. This relationship existed entirely off-camera, conducted during his time away from filming through careful scheduling and strict privacy measures. The woman, a successful real estate attorney, had no interest in television fame and had agreed to the relationship partly on the condition that it remain entirely private. This dual relationship period wasn't about deception in the traditional sense. Parker was honest with both women about not being exclusive, though neither fully understood the extent of his compartmentalized life. The real estate attorney knew he did mining and some television work, but had no concept of his fame or the scope of Gold Rush's audience. Ashley knew about his business interests, but not their full extent or the other relationships those businesses had spawned. When Ashley left, the public narrative focused on the difficulties of their relationship. Given Parker's demanding work schedule and emotional unavailability, the real story was more complicated. Ashley had begun discovering the extent of Parker's secret business empire and was uncomfortable with the level of deception required to maintain it. She'd stumbled across documents revealing property holdings he'd never mentioned. Met business associates who seemed surprised she existed. She gradually realized that Parker's life was far more complex than she'd understood. Following his split with Ashley, Parker became even more secretive about his romantic life. He dated several women who had no connection to mining or television, including a tech entrepreneur from Seattle and a physician from Australia. These relationships were conducted almost entirely in secret, with Parker flying to meet them during breaks in filming or hosting them at properties he owned under corporate names. The level of operational security he employed would have impressed intelligence agencies. The most surprising relationship was one that had begun years earlier and continued on and off throughout his 20s. A woman he'd known since high school, someone who'd grown up in Alaska and understood the mining culture, but had moved away to pursue her own career in finance, had maintained a connection with Parker that few people knew about. Their relationship was sporadic, reuniting when he was back in Alaska or during rare moments when their schedules aligned. But it represented something genuine in Parker's otherwise carefully staged life. This woman knew both versions of Parker, the real person she'd grown up with and the television character he'd become. She was one of the few people who understood the full scope of his double life because she'd watched it develop from the beginning. Their relationship was complicated by distance, timing, and Parker's increasingly fragmented existence, but it persisted as perhaps the most authentic connection in his otherwise compartmentalized world. Parker's approach to relationships reflected his broader strategy of separation and control. He kept romantic partners separate from his mining crew, his business associates separate from his family, and his various friend groups isolated from one another. This wasn't just about privacy. It was about maintaining different versions of himself for different audiences, never allowing anyone to see the complete picture. The emotional cost was significant. Intimacy requires vulnerability and honesty, but Parker had built his life around careful information management and strategic presentation. Genuine connection became increasingly difficult as his web of separate identities grew more complex. Several relationships ended not because of fundamental incompatibility, but because the women involved felt they were only seeing part of who Parker really was and grew frustrated by the barriers he maintained. Social media complicated matters further. Parker maintained a public Instagram account that projected the image of the dedicated miner. Still, he also had private accounts under different names that he used to follow business associates, track investments, and maintain connections with people from his non-mining life. When romantic partners discovered these alternate accounts, it raised questions about what else he might be hiding, eroding trust even when there was no infidelity involved. By his late 20s, Parker had developed a reputation in certain circles as someone difficult to know truly. Business associates appreciated his competence but found him guarded. Friends enjoyed his company but sensed a sense of emotional distance. Romantic partners were drawn to his success and intensity but struggled with his compartmentalization and secrecy. He'd become remarkably successful at maintaining his double life but increasingly isolated within it. The situation reached a crisis point when one of Parker's romantic partners, frustrated by his secrecy and sensing there were significant aspects of his life he wasn't sharing, hired a private investigator. What that investigator uncovered shocked her. The full scope of Parker's business empire, his multiple properties, his various corporate entities, and evidence of other relationships. She confronted him with this information, and while Parker was able to explain and provide context, the confrontation forced him to recognize how unsustainable his approach had become. This incident didn't immediately become public. But it marked a turning point. Parker began to realize that the double life he'd so carefully constructed was becoming its own kind of prison, limiting his ability to form genuine connections and forcing him to calculate what information was safe to share with whom constantly. The revelation that would eventually expose his secret life to the public was still coming. Still, internally, Parker was beginning to question whether the elaborate facade he'd built was worth maintaining. The revelation that changed everything. The public revelation of Parker Schnabel's double life didn't come from a planned announcement or carefully orchestrated public relations campaign. Instead, it emerged through a series of seemingly unrelated events that when pieced together exposed the full scope of what Parker had been hiding. It began with a legal dispute. One of Parker's business partners in a real estate venture filed a lawsuit over a disagreement about profit distribution. The lawsuit itself wasn't particularly noteworthy, but the court filings were public records and contained detailed information about Parker's involvement in the company, his investment amounts, and his ownership stakes in related entities. A sharp-eyed journalist covering business news in Seattle noticed Parker's name in the documents and began investigating. What this journalist discovered sparked a comprehensive investigation that would eventually pull back the curtain on Parker's secret empire. Public record searches revealed a web of corporate entities connected to Parker through shared addresses, standard phone numbers, and then business partners who appeared across multiple companies. Property records showed holdings far beyond what a television-famous gold miner would be expected to possess. Financial disclosures from the publicly traded companies he'd invested in revealed positions worth millions of dollars. The story broke first on a business news website, not an entertainment outlet. The headline focused on the surprising business acumen of a reality television star, framing Parker as a savvy investor who'd built a substantial fortune beyond his television income. The article was relatively flattering, portraying him as more intelligent and more sophisticated than his on-screen character suggested, but it also exposed information Parker had worked hard to keep private. Gold Rush fans were shocked. The image they'd held of Parker as a simple, dedicated miner was suddenly complicated by revelations of cryptocurrency investments, international business dealings, and a real estate empire. Social media erupted with reactions ranging from admiration for his business success to anger at what some perceived as deception. Comment sections were filled with debates about authenticity, whether Parker had been lying to his audience and what this meant for the show's credibility. The show's cred. Parker initially tried to downplay the revelations, releasing a brief statement acknowledging his business interests while emphasizing that his passion for mining remained genuine. But the story had momentum. Other journalists picked it up, digging deeper into his various ventures and uncovering additional details. Financial publications began analyzing his investment strategy. Mining industry outlets discussed his off-camera operations. Entertainment media focused on the apparent contradiction between his television persona and his actual business activities. The Discovery Channel faced difficult questions about what they knew and when they knew it. Producers acknowledged that they'd been aware Parker had outside business interests, but claimed they hadn't understood the full scope. They defended the show's authenticity by arguing that what appeared on screen was real. Parker genuinely ran mining operations, genuinely faced the challenges depicted, and genuinely extracted gold. The fact that he also did other things off-camera didn't make the televised content false, but some fans felt betrayed. They'd invested emotionally in Parker's story as they understood it. A young man honoring his grandfather's legacy by dedicating himself to mining. The revelation that this was only part of his life, perhaps not even the most critical part financially, felt like a violation of trust. Online forums are filled with people reassessing their perception of Parker and questioning what else about the show might not be what it seemed. Parker's response evolved as the story continued to develop. In a series of interviews, he opened up about the challenges of living in the public eye, the pressure to maintain a particular image, and his desire to keep certain aspects of his life private. He argued that the business ventures he'd pursued didn't diminish his commitment to mining, but rather demonstrated his grandfather's lessons about hard work and smart investing. He'd simply applied those principles more broadly than television showed. He also addressed the complexities of his relationship, acknowledging without providing details that his romantic life had been more private than what appeared on the show. He defended this choice by pointing to the difficulties public relationships faced under the scrutiny of millions of viewers, using his televised relationship with Ashley as an example of how painful it could be when intimate matters played out on screen. Interestingly, public opinion began to shift as more information emerged. Initial shock gave way to a more nuanced understanding. Many people came to view Parker's business success as impressive rather than deceptive. The narrative shifted from reality star caught lying to reality star revealed as savvy businessman. His investments in environmental conservation once revealed generated favorable coverage. His early adoption of cryptocurrency led to profiles in financial publications that portrayed him as unexpectedly forward-thinking. The impact of the gold rush was complex. Ratings initially spiked as curious viewers tuned in to see how the show would address the revelations. The producers made the strategic decision to incorporate Parker's broader business interests into the narrative rather than continuing to ignore them. Showing him taking calls about other ventures and acknowledging the full scope of his activities. This transparency actually strengthened the show by making it feel more authentic and less staged. Parker himself seemed relieved in some ways. The burden of maintaining completely separate lives had been exhausting. While the public exposure was uncomfortable, it also freed him from the constant vigilance required to keep his various worlds apart. He could be more open about his interests, more honest about his ambitions, and more integrated as a person rather than a collection of incompatible identities. The financial impact was mixed. Some endorsement deals fell through as companies worried about the perception of inauthenticity. But new opportunities emerged as his reputation as a successful investor opened doors in the business world. His real estate ventures benefited from increased visibility, with some properties gaining value simply from the Parker-Schnabel connection, now public knowledge. Perhaps most significantly, the revelation forced Parker to confront fundamental questions about identity, authenticity, and what he actually wanted from his life. In his early 30s now, he'd spent half his life in the public eye and most of his 20s maintaining an elaborate double life. The exhausting work of keeping everything separate had ended. But the challenge of integrating everything into a coherent whole was just beginning. Parker Schnabel's story reminds us that, like all media, reality television shows us carefully selected slices of much larger, more complex lives. His double life wasn't about deception so much as about a young man trying to maintain privacy and autonomy amid constant public scrutiny. Today, Parker continues mining, building his business empire, and learning how to balance his public persona with his private reality. What do you think about Parker's secret life? Were his actions justified, or did he betray his audience's trust? Share your thoughts in the comments below and don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from the world of Gold Rush.